She arrived on a Thursday with $11 sewn into the hem of her only good dress and a letter that promised a man she had never met. The stagecoach left her at the base of the valley, where the road ended and the pines began, and she walked the last mile on foot because there was no one to carry her trunk. The cabin, when she reached it, had smoke rising from its chimney and a man standing in the doorway who did not smile and did not step forward. People in the valley would later say that the quietest man in the territory had taken the loneliest woman in it, and that neither fact had been an accident. Nathan Cooper had not fired a gun in 4 years, though his hands remembered the weight of one the way a man remembers a language he no longer speaks. He had come to the valley to be forgotten, and mostly he had been. He raised cattle, mended fence, and spoke only when speaking could not be avoided. When the letter had come asking if he would take a wife by arrangement, he had answered yes, though he could not have said, even to himself, exactly why. Josephine had left behind a town that no longer wanted her, and a name that had been spoken more in scorn than in kindness. She came west, not for romance but for room to breathe, and she expected little beyond a roof and a stove. What she did not expect was a man who asked for nothing, who did not press her for warmth she had not yet decided to give, and who moved through his own house the way a man moves when he is not asking for anything. Trust in that valley was not given. It was earned in the small hours before dawn, in wood already chopped, in suppers left warm without comment, in silence that did not demand to be filled. And somewhere beneath that silence sat an old debt neither of them had spoken of, a past that would eventually walk up the road and knock on the cabin door. This is the story of a woman who came west with nothing but a satchel and her pride, and a man who had buried his gun but not his history. It is a story about what it costs to trust again, and what a man will do without ever raising his voice to prove that he is worth the trying. Josephine Hale had not always been a woman people whispered about. She had once been the seamstress's daughter in a town called Millbrook, known for a steady hand with a needle and a laugh that carried across the churchyard on Sunday mornings. She had been engaged once to a merchant's son named Everett Price, and for a season she had believed her life would be an ordinary one, filled with ordinary comforts. That belief had ended on a spring evening when Everett's family discovered a debt her late father had left behind, and the engagement had been broken with the same quiet efficiency as a ledger being closed. After that, Millbrook remembered her only as the girl who had been left. And a woman who has been left, she learned, is rarely given the benefit of the doubt twice. But to understand the day she reached Nathan Cooper's valley, it is necessary to go back further still, to the winter before, when the seamstress shop where Josephine worked began to fail. Orders slowed. Coin grew scarce. Her mother's cough worsened with the cold, and the medicine the doctor recommended cost more than a week's wages. Josephine did not complain, because complaining had never put bread on a table. But she began to understand that her circumstances required a kind of courage she had not yet been asked to have. It was in that winter that she first saw the advertisement, folded small inside a church bulletin, seeking a wife for a rancher in the Western Territories, a man of good character and steady means, willing to correspond. She answered it not out of hope, but out of arithmetic. A husband meant a roof that did not depend on Millbrook's opinion of her. It meant distance from a name that had become, in that town, a kind of quiet joke. She wrote 3 letters before receiving a reply, and the reply when it came was short and unadorned, signed simply, Nathan Cooper. He did not ask about her past. He did not offer flattering words about her future. He wrote only of the valley, the cabin, the cattle, and the winters, and something in the plainness of it steadied her more than any promise could have. A man who did not reach for pretty words, she reasoned, was perhaps a man who did not have anything to hide behind them. Her mother did not live to see her leave, which was its own private grief, folded away and carried west along with everything else. Josephine sold what furniture remained, paid what debts she could, and boarded a train with a single trunk and a satchel that held her mother's sewing shears wrapped in a handkerchief for safekeeping. The journey took the better part of 9 days, through country that grew wider and emptier with every mile, until the trees thinned into rangeland, and the rangeland climbed slowly into hills she had no name for. She watched the land change through the window and thought without any particular sorrow that whatever waited at the end of it could hardly judge her more harshly than Millbrook had. The stage that carried her the final stretch left her at a trading post 2 hours before the valley proper, where a man named Harvey ran the store and arranged for a wagon to take newcomers the rest of the way. Harvey looked at her trunk, then at her hands, then asked, not unkindly, whether she was the one Cooper had sent for. Josephine said that she supposed she was. Harvey said nothing further, only nodded toward a wagon hitched outside, driven by a boy of perhaps 14 who spoke even less than Harvey had. The road that followed climbed through stands of pine so thick the light fell in narrow bars across the wagon bed, and Josephine sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, the way a woman sits when she has decided that whatever comes next, she will meet it standing. What she knew of Nathan Cooper by that point could be written on a single page. He was 34 years of age. He had come to the valley some years earlier and built the cabin and the fences himself, with help from no one that Harvey mentioned by name. He kept to himself, ran a modest herd, and was owed money by no man and owed none in return. There were rumors, Harvey had said only once, glancing sideways as he said it, about what Cooper had done before he came west, but rumors were not facts, and Harvey did not deal in things he could not confirm. Josephine had turned that single sentence over in her mind for the length of the wagon ride, the way a woman turns over a stone she suspects is heavier than it looks. The boy driving the wagon spoke only once, near the top of a long rise, to say that the Cooper place was just past the tree line, and that Cooper kept a dog that barked at strangers but had never yet bitten one. Josephine thanked him for the information and found, to her own mild surprise, that she was grateful for it. A dog that barked but did not bite seemed, in that moment, a reasonable enough welcome to expect. She smoothed her skirt, checked that her hair had not come loose from its pins, and told herself, in the plain and practical language she had used to steady herself through every hardship since her father's death, that a house is only a house, and a man is only a man, and both could be managed with patience. The valley opened before the wagon the way a held breath opens into an exhale, wide and quiet, and rimmed with mountains still capped in the last of the winter snow. Smoke was already threading up from somewhere beyond the pines, thin and steady against a sky gone the color of pewter. Josephine did not know, as the wagon carried her closer, that the man waiting at the end of that road had spent the morning debating whether to put on his good shirt, and had decided against it, on the reasoning that a woman coming that far for a marriage of convenience did not need to be lied to about the kind of life she was arriving into. She did not know that he had chopped extra wood the night before, out of a nervousness he would not have named as such. She knew only that the road was narrowing, and the trees were parting, and that whatever waited beyond them was the beginning of the only life she had left to choose. Some things a person cannot prepare for, no matter how much arithmetic they have done in advance. Josephine had prepared for hardship, for cold, for a man who might be difficult or distant or worse. She had not prepared for the particular silence that settled over the wagon as it crested the final rise, a silence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange, suspended feeling of arriving at the exact center of one's own uncertain future. The wagon slowed. The dog began to bark, once, then fell quiet. And somewhere ahead, past the last of the pines, the valley that would either save her or simply hold her was waiting, indifferent to which it would turn out to be. The wagon came to a stop at the edge of a yard, swept clean of debris, and Nathan Cooper stepped down from the porch before the dust had settled around the wheels. He was taller than Josephine had pictured, and quieter in his movements than any man she had known, the way he crossed the yard, suggesting neither hurry nor hesitation. He did not offer his hand right away. Instead, he looked at her trunk, then at her face, and said only that the road was long and she must be tired. It was not a warm greeting, but it was not a cold one either, and Josephine decided, in the space of that single sentence, that she could work with a man who measured his words so carefully. He carried her trunk into the cabin himself, refusing the boy's offer of help with a shake of his head, and set it down near a narrow bed against the far wall without comment on where she might prefer it. The cabin was small but sturdier than she had expected, with a stone hearth at its center and shelves built with a carpenter's patience along one wall. There was a cedar chest at the foot of the bed, its lid closed, and Josephine would learn only much later what it held, and did not hold. For now she noted only that the floor had been swept, the linens looked freshly aired, and a pot of something savory sat warming near the fire, which told her more about the man than any of his letters had. Supper that first evening passed with fewer than 20 words exchanged between them. Nathan asked whether the stew suited her, and she said that it did, and he nodded once and did not ask again, as though a single confirmation was all the reassurance he required. She asked, in turn, how long he had kept the place, and he answered with a number of years, but no story attached to it. The way a man answers when he has decided a fact does not need decoration. Josephine found she did not mind the silence so much as she had feared she would. It left room, she thought, for a person to arrange her own thoughts without interruption. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them spoke aloud, but both seemed to understand. Nathan rose before light to see to the cattle and the fences, and by the time Josephine woke, there was already a fire built and water drawn, set beside the stove without a word said about it. She, in turn, began to manage the household in the manner she had managed her mother's home in Millbrook, mending what needed mending, cooking what the pantry allowed, and keeping the cabin in a state of order that seemed to please Nathan without his ever saying so directly. He noticed things. She could tell by the way his eyes moved over a swept floor or a patched shirt, lingering just long enough to register the effort before he returned to whatever task occupied his hands. It was on a Tuesday, some 2 weeks into her arrival, that Josephine first noticed the holster. It hung on a peg inside a small closet near the back door, half hidden behind a coat, and she came upon it only because she had been searching for a broom. She did not touch it. She only looked at it the way a person looks at an object they were not meant to find, and then closed the closet door and said nothing. That evening, watching Nathan clean his boots by the fire with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, she found herself studying his hands and wondering what they had done before they had learned to be so gentle with a boot brush. The town, such as it was, sat a half-day's ride from the cabin, a scattering of buildings around a dry goods store and a small white church that served the valley's scattered ranches. Josephine met its residents for the first time on a Sunday, when Nathan hitched the wagon without being asked and drove her to services without offering an opinion on whether she ought to go. The congregation received her with the particular courtesy people reserve for something they have not yet decided how to categorize. It was a woman named Martha Ellison, the Reverend's sister, who studied Josephine longest, her eyes moving from her plain dress to her ringless hand before the ceremony had even properly begun, and said nothing, which somehow felt louder than speech. After services, gathered near the churchyard fence, Martha found occasion to remark, to no one in particular but clearly for Josephine's benefit, that arrangements made by letter seemed a strange foundation for a marriage, and that a woman ought to know a man's character before she shared his roof. Nathan, standing near enough to hear, said nothing in response, though Josephine noticed the set of his jaw change, just slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when he has decided a thing is not worth defending aloud. He simply took her elbow, not urgently, and guided her toward the wagon, and the gesture said more in its restraint than any argument could have. Back at the cabin that evening, Josephine asked him carefully whether the town often spoke of him the way Martha had. Nathan was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, he said only that people believed what was easiest to believe, and that he had stopped trying to correct them some years back. It was not self-pity in his voice, only a kind of weathered acceptance, the tone of a man who has made peace with being misunderstood because the alternative cost more than it was worth. Josephine did not press further, though she filed the answer away carefully, the way she filed away every small piece of him that did not fit the shape of rumor. Over the weeks that followed, small courtesies began to accumulate between them. None of them declared. All of them noticed. He mended the porch step without her asking. She began leaving his coffee exactly as he liked it, black and strong, after watching him drink it black and strong for a month without comment. He brought her wildflowers once, from the far pasture, and set them on the table without a word, then left for the barn before she could thank him, as though thanks were a transaction he preferred to avoid. She began to understand that Nathan Cooper's affection, if that was even the word for it yet, arrived in objects and gestures rather than sentences, and that a woman who waited for him to speak his feelings might wait a very long time indeed. Trust, she was learning, was not a door that opened all at once. It was built the way the cabin itself had been built, log by log, with patience and without haste, each piece tested before the next was laid upon it. She did not yet know what lay behind the silence in his jaw when Martha spoke, or what the holster in the closet had once been used for, or why a man with no known family had come so far west to be alone. But she knew the fire was lit each morning before she woke, and the water was drawn, and the coffee was left black and strong, and for now, in a life that had given her so little certainty, those small facts were enough to build a foundation on. Spring came late to the valley that year, the frost holding stubbornly to the shaded pastures long after the sun had warmed the open ground. Josephine had settled into a rhythm by then that felt, if not entirely like home, at least like something steady enough to stand on. She had learned the names of the cattle Nathan cared for and the particular creak of the porch step he had mended, and she had stopped flinching, most days, at the silences that had once unsettled her. It was a Wednesday, and she was hanging linens on the line strung between the cabin and the barn, when the dog began to bark in a manner she had not heard before, low and steady, aimed at the road rather than at nothing in particular. A rider came into view at the tree line, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted his welcome. He wore a duster, gone gray with dust, and a hat pulled low, and something in the way he sat his horse made Josephine set down the basket of linens without quite deciding to. Nathan came around the side of the barn at the sound of the dog, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped when he saw the rider clearly. Josephine watched something pass over his face that she had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of stillness that seemed to require effort to maintain. The rider drew up at the edge of the yard and did not dismount right away. He looked at Nathan for a long moment, then touched the brim of his hat toward Josephine with a courtesy that felt, somehow, more threatening than rudeness would have. He said his name was Dutch Riordan, and that he had come a long way to find an old acquaintance, and that he wondered whether Nathan Cooper still went by the name he had used back in the Kansas territory. Nathan said nothing at first, only stepped forward until he stood between the rider and the cabin, a positioning Josephine noted without fully understanding why it mattered. What came next was said in a language Josephine did not entirely follow, full of names she had never heard, and a debt that seemed to concern a card game and a man who had died over it. Though whether Nathan had caused that death or merely witnessed it, Dutch Riordan did not make clear, and Nathan did not offer to clarify. What she understood watching from the yard with the basket of linens forgotten at her feet, was that this was the past Harvey had mentioned once and never again, arrived now in the flesh, sitting a horse in her own front yard. She understood, too, that Nathan's hand had not moved toward the holster he kept in the closet, though every line of his body suggested he knew exactly how quickly it could. Reardon said that he had not come for trouble, only for what he was owed, and named a sum that seemed modest for the weight it carried in the silence that followed. Nathan asked him to wait and walked to the cabin without hurry, and returned a few minutes later with coin counted out from a tin box Josephine had seen once, tucked beneath a loose floorboard she had assumed held nothing of consequence. He handed it over without a word of negotiation, and Reardon counted it with the casual thoroughness of a man who trusted no one, then nodded once, as though a ledger somewhere had finally been balanced to his satisfaction. Before he turned his horse, Reardon looked past Nathan toward Josephine and said, not unkindly, that he supposed Cooper had told her all about Kansas and about the man who had not walked away from that card table. Nathan's jaw tightened, the same shift Josephine had seen once before at the edge of a churchyard. But he said nothing, and it was that silence, more than any denial could have, that convinced Josephine the truth was neither as simple nor as damning as Reardon wished it to sound. Reardon waited a moment longer, as though hoping for a reaction that did not come, then turned his horse and rode back the way he had arrived, and the valley swallowed the sound of his hoofbeats within a few short minutes. Neither of them spoke for a long while after the dust had settled. Josephine finished hanging the linens because her hands needed something to do, and Nathan returned to the barn because his did too, and it was not until supper that either of them addressed what had happened. She asked him plainly whether it was true, and he set down his fork and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided, finally, is worth the risk of losing. He told her, in fewer words than the story likely deserved, that there had been a card game, and a man who had cheated, and a fight that had ended with a death neither side had planned, and that he had left Kansas, not because he was guilty, but because guilt and suspicion had, by then, become impossible to tell apart. He said he did not expect her to simply take his word for it, and that she was owed the choice of believing him or not. It was, Josephine realized, the longest speech she had heard him give since her arrival, and the plainness of it, the total absence of pleading in it, was what convinced her more than any of the words themselves. She said only that she believed him, and he nodded once, and neither of them said anything further about it that night, though something in the room felt different afterward, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the fire burning low in the hearth. It was 2 days later, on a Friday, mending a torn seam by the window, that Josephine looked up to find Nathan watching her from across the room, not with the guarded distance he usually kept, but with something steadier, something that had been waiting, she suspected, for a long while to be let forward. He crossed the room without announcement and sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and set his hand down on the table beside hers, not over it, not claiming it, simply beside it, the way a man rests a hand near something he has decided he no longer needs to hurry toward. Josephine did not move her hand away. Neither of them spoke of it directly, because some things, Josephine was beginning to understand, were too large for naming, and naming them too soon could crush what had taken so long to grow. She finished her mending with his hand resting near hers, and the fire popped once in the hearth. And outside the window, the last of the daylight moved slowly across the pasture where his horse grazed undisturbed. It was not a declaration. It was not even, strictly, a beginning. But it was the first time since she had arrived that Josephine felt the valley might, after all, hold something meant for her to keep. Word of Dutch Riordan's visit reached the town long before Josephine and Nathan did, carried the way such things always traveled in a valley that small, from Harvey's trading post to the church pews within a matter of days. By the time they arrived for Sunday services, The story had grown several sizes beyond the truth, and Josephine braced herself for the kind of judgment Martha Ellison had offered so freely before. What she found instead was a curious, watchful silence, as though the congregation had not yet decided which version of the story to believe, and were waiting, for once, to see the man himself before passing sentence. It was Harvey, of all people, who spoke first, catching Nathan near the churchyard fence to say, plainly, that he had heard Cooper paid off a debt rather than reaching for a gun, and that this seemed to him the mark of a man more interested in peace than trouble. Nathan only nodded, offering no elaboration, but Josephine saw the way several heads turned at the remark, recalculating something they had assumed settled. Martha, standing near the church steps with her usual composure, said nothing at all that morning, and her silence, for the first time since Josephine's arrival, felt less like judgment and more like a woman quietly revising her opinion in private. The weeks that followed brought a shift so gradual that Josephine almost missed it happening. A neighbor woman named Evelyn Marsh, whom Josephine had exchanged little more than polite greetings with before, began stopping by on Thursdays with preserves or spare thread, staying long enough to talk of small things: the weather, the calving season. Nothing of consequence, but the visits themselves were a kind of statement. Children from a neighboring ranch, sent once to deliver a message, lingered afterward to watch Nathan work with the horses, and he let them, showing more patience with their questions than Josephine had ever seen him show anyone. The valley, it seemed, was not a place that apologized in words. It simply began, slowly, to make room. It was on a Tuesday in early summer that Nathan came in from the pasture earlier than usual, his boots still dusty, and set something on the table without announcement before returning to his chores as though it were nothing. Josephine found it while preparing supper, a small tin of lamp oil beside a new glass chimney for the porch lantern, the old one having cracked some weeks before in a way she had mentioned only once, in passing, and assumed forgotten. She stood holding the new glass for a long moment, turning it over in her hands, understanding that this was simply how the man spoke, in small repairs and remembered details, and that she had, without quite noticing, learned to read him fluently. That evening she lit the new lantern and set it on the porch rail as the light failed, a habit she had begun without deciding to, and one Nathan had never commented on directly, though she noticed he always seemed to find some reason to be near the porch when the flame caught. He came to stand beside her that night, not speaking, watching the light settle over the yard and the corral beyond it, and after a while he said, in the plain voice he used for things that mattered most, that the valley suited her better than she likely believed it did. Josephine said that she was beginning to believe it herself, and something in his expression eased at that, the corner of his mouth moving in the smallest suggestion of a smile. There is a saying, common enough among people who have weathered hard winters together, that trust is not something a person is given, but something they build, log by log, the same as any shelter meant to last. Josephine thought of this often that summer, watching the cabin fill with small evidences of a life no longer merely arranged but chosen, deliberately, day after day, by two people who had learned to speak more through gesture than through words. She thought, too, of Millbrook and of Everett Price, and found that the memory no longer carried the sting it once had, having been replaced by something steadier and far less inclined to leave. By the time autumn came, turning the aspens gold along the ridge above the cabin, Martha Ellison herself stopped Josephine after services to say, with the particular stiffness of a woman unaccustomed to admitting error, that she had perhaps judged the arrangement too harshly at the outset, and that Cooper seemed, on further acquaintance, a decent enough man. It was not an apology, not precisely, but it was as close to one as the town was ever likely to offer, and Josephine accepted it in the same spirit it was given, with a nod and no further comment, understanding by then that some concessions are made in silence because silence is the only language proud people have left to make them in. The wind moved through the pines above the valley the way it always had, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its branches. And the fire in the cabin hearth burned each evening, the same as it had burned the first night Josephine arrived, warming a room that had slowly, without ceremony, become something more than four walls and a roof. The horse stood in the corral as the light faded, tail switching lazily against the last of the summer flies, and smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. The same signal of shelter and supper it had always been, meant now for two people instead of one. The river beyond the tree line ran low and clear under the autumn sun, the way it had run every autumn before this one, and would run every autumn after, indifferent to whether anyone stood on its bank to notice. Some things a person cannot rush, no matter how much they might wish to. And trust, Josephine had learned, was chief among them. The fire burned. The wind moved through the pines. The world continued, exactly as it always had. And within it, quietly, without announcement, a woman who had arrived with nothing but a satchel and a name too easily doubted had found a place that no longer required her to apologize for either. And that was the story of Josephine Hale and Nathan Cooper, a woman who came west with nothing but a bag and a spine, and left with a home, a name restored, and a man who had waited, without ever asking, for her to decide he was worth trusting. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.